In a narrow alley behind Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, a homeless young woman was about to offer her only meal to a stranger. What started as an evening escape from kitchen chaos took a shocking turn when she came face to face with a broken man in chef's whites. Marisol Vega wasn't your typical street dweller. For 8 months, she had spent her life surviving on city corners, known for writing children's stories about hope and friendship in a worn notebook. When she encountered Lucas slumped on a wooden crate, clutching his head in despair, she had no idea she was walking into the life of a Michelin-starred celebrity chef. Marisol extended her paper-wrapped sandwich with words that would lead to both their salvation. "You look tired, mister. Take my sandwich." What began as a simple act of kindness would become a transformation that bridged 2 worlds. The restaurant district would never be the same after a homeless storyteller reminded a famous chef why he first fell in love with feeding people. This is the story of how the smallest gesture from someone with nothing became nourishment for someone who had everything, except what mattered most. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The clatter of plates against steel echoed through the kitchen like gunfire, each sound piercing deeper into Lucas Moreno's skull. He stood at the pass, watching his team move in the choreographed chaos he had once found beautiful. Now it felt suffocating. The heat from the grills pressed against his face, mixing with the weight of expectations that had accumulated over 15 years of Michelin stars and magazine covers. "Behind, chef," Frankie called out, sliding past with a tower of dirty dishes balanced in his arms. The young dishwasher's enthusiasm used to remind Lucas of himself, back when cooking felt like discovery rather than performance. Tonight, it only emphasized how far he had drifted from that fire. Lucas wiped his hands on his apron, the white fabric already stained with the evening's battles. The dining room beyond the kitchen doors hummed with the satisfied murmur of guests who had paid handsomely for his vision of elevated Latin cuisine. They spoke his name with reverence, photographed their plates with religious devotion, and left feeling they had experienced something transcendent. But Lucas felt nothing. He was a ghost haunting his own success. "Table 7 wants to send compliments to the chef," Ramon called from the hotline, his weathered face creased with the kind of smile that had carried them through countless services together. "The woman says the mole reminds her of her grandmother's." Lucas nodded absently. Once, those words would have filled him with pride. Tonight, they felt like stones in his chest. He had built this restaurant, Corazon, as a love letter to his Aunt Sophia's kitchen in Queens, where food meant family and every meal was a celebration. Now it felt like a mausoleum, preserving something beautiful that had already died. The back door called to him like a siren. Lucas glanced around the kitchen, confirming that the evening service could survive without him for a few minutes. Ramon caught his eye and nodded knowingly. His sous chef had been watching Lucas retreat into himself for months, helpless to pull him back from whatever precipice he was approaching. The alley behind Corazon was a different world from the polished dining room. Here, dumpsters lined the narrow space between buildings, and the autumn wind carried the scent of rain and exhaust. A single streetlight flickered overhead, casting unstable shadows that danced across the brick walls. Lucas sank onto a wooden crate that had once held produce from the farmer's market, buried his face in his hands, and let the silence wash over him. His marriage to Elena had become a series of polite conversations between strangers. She attended his restaurant events, smiled for photographers, and slept in the guest room. Their shared dreams of children and Sunday brunches had withered under the relentless demands of his career. When she spoke of feeling like a widow to his ambition, he had no defense. The success he had fought for had become a prison, and he was both the warden and the inmate. The soft scuff of footsteps on asphalt made him look up. A young woman stood at the mouth of the alley, silhouetted against the amber glow of the street beyond. She was small and slight, wrapped in layers of mismatched clothing that spoke of careful preservation rather than fashion. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she clutched something wrapped in brown paper against her chest. She hesitated, studying him with eyes that held too much understanding for someone so young. Lucas straightened, suddenly aware that he must look like exactly what he was, a man who had everything and felt empty. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but clear. She took a tentative step closer, and the streetlight caught the worry lines around her eyes. "You look tired, mister." Lucas opened his mouth to deflect, to assure her he was fine, but the words wouldn't come. There was something in her manner that made pretense impossible. She approached with the careful grace of someone accustomed to reading danger in shadows, yet her expression held only concern. "Take my sandwich," she said, extending the paper-wrapped bundle toward him. "You need it more than I do." The offer hit him like a physical blow. Here was this woman, clearly struggling herself, offering him what might be her only meal. Lucas stared at the sandwich, recognizing the institutional wrapping of a shelter meal. She had saved it, carried it through the streets, and now wanted to give it to a stranger who sat outside one of the city's most expensive restaurants. "I can't," he started, but she pressed it into his hands before he could finish the protest. "Everyone needs to eat," she said simply. "Even sad-looking men in clean aprons." Her fingers brushed his as she transferred the sandwich, and Lucas felt something electric pass between them. Not romance, but recognition. She saw him, not the chef, not the brand, not the success story, but the man sitting alone in an alley because he couldn't bear to be around people who thought they knew him. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice rougher than intended. She studied him for a long moment, as if deciding whether he was safe. "Marisol," she said finally. "Marisol Vega." "Lucas." He held up the sandwich. "Thank you, Marisol. This means more than you know." A small smile crossed her face, transforming her features. For a moment, the worry lines disappeared, and Lucas glimpsed the girl she might have been in different circumstances. "We all need taking care of sometimes," she said. She turned to go, but Lucas found himself standing. "Wait," he called. Not sure what he wanted to say, she paused, looking back over her shoulder. Will you be around tomorrow night?" The question surprised them both. Marisol tilted her head, considering. "I might be," she said carefully. "The city's big, but some corners feel safer than others." After she disappeared into the maze of streets beyond the alley, Lucas remained standing, the sandwich warm in his hands. For the first time in months, he felt something other than numbness. It wasn't happiness, exactly, but it was movement. A crack in the ice that had formed around his heart. He looked down at the simple meal wrapped in brown paper. Inside the restaurant, diners were paying $50 for his interpretation of street food, elevated with technique and presentation. This sandwich, offered freely by someone who had every reason to keep it, felt more valuable than anything he had created in years. Lucas slipped back into the kitchen, the sandwich tucked carefully in his jacket pocket. The service continued around him, but something had shifted. Ramon noticed it immediately. The way Lucas moved with slightly more presence, the way he actually tasted the sauce he was adjusting, instead of just going through the motions. "Everything okay, chef?" Ramon asked during a brief lull. Lucas touched the sandwich through his jacket. "I think it might be," he said, surprising himself with the truth of it. The following evening found Lucas pacing the kitchen with an energy that had been absent for months. He caught himself glancing toward the back door every few minutes, and when Ramon raised an eyebrow at his restlessness, Lucas pretended to be checking inventory. The sandwich from the night before sat untouched in his office refrigerator, too precious to eat and too meaningful to discard. "You're wound tighter than a spring tonight, chef," Ramon observed, sliding a perfect plate of pescado a la plancha across the pass. His weathered hands moved with the confidence of 15 years working beside Lucas. But his eyes held concern. "What's got you so jumpy?" Lucas forced himself to focus on the plate, though his mind kept drifting to the alley outside. "Just thinking about menu changes for next month," he lied, garnishing the fish with microgreens that would have made his younger self roll his eyes at their pretension. The truth was more complicated. He had spent the day thinking about Marisol's face in the flickering streetlight, the way she had offered her meal without hesitation or expectation of gratitude. In his world of transactional relationships and calculated generosity, her simple kindness felt revolutionary. During his afternoon break, he had walked the neighborhood surrounding the restaurant, ostensibly checking on suppliers but really hoping to catch a glimpse of her. The city suddenly felt different, layered with invisible lives he had never bothered to notice. How many people like Marisol moved through his neighborhood while he focused only on the narrow world of his kitchen? As the dinner service reached its peak, Lucas found excuses to step outside, first to check the evening's deliveries. Then, to ensure the dumpsters were properly positioned. Finally, he simply stood in the alley, smoking a cigarette he didn't want, and listening to the sounds of the city beyond his restaurant's walls. Looking for someone? Frankie appeared beside him, arms crossed against the October chill. The dishwasher was barely 20, with the kind of earnest ambition that reminded Lucas painfully of himself at that age. Despite working the least glamorous position in the kitchen, Frankie watched everything, absorbed every technique, and asked thoughtful questions during quiet moments. Lucas stubbed out his cigarette. "Just getting some air?" Frankie nodded, but his expression suggested he wasn't buying the explanation. "There's this girl," he said casually. "Comes around here sometimes. Real quiet, keeps to herself. I've seen her sitting on the fire escape across the street, writing in this little notebook." Lucas tried to keep his voice neutral. "What about her?" "Nothing bad," Frankie said quickly. "She seems nice, polite when I've said hello, but she's always alone, you know? Looks like she could use a friend." He glanced at Lucas sideways. "Or maybe a good meal." The implication hung in the air between them. Lucas wondered how transparent his interest had become, how many of his staff had noticed his distraction. But instead of embarrassment, he felt something like relief. Maybe caring about someone outside his professional circle wasn't weakness. Maybe it was exactly what had been missing. "She mentioned she writes stories," Lucas found himself saying. "Children's stories." Frankie's face lit up. "That's beautiful, chef. My little sister loves stories, always begging someone to read to her." He paused. "You think she'd mind if I said hello next time I see her? Just to be friendly?" The possessiveness that flared in Lucas's chest surprised him. He barely knew Marisol, had no claim on her time or attention, yet the thought of someone else approaching her felt wrong. But looking at Frankie's genuine enthusiasm, he recognized his own selfishness. "I think she'd appreciate kindness," Lucas said carefully, "but she seems cautious. Don't push." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the pedestrians pass by the alley's mouth. Lucas found himself scanning each figure, hoping to see Marisol's slight form emerge from the shadows. The city felt alive with possibility in a way it hadn't for years. A soft laugh made both men turn. Marisol stood at the edge of the alley, notebook clutched against her chest, watching them with amusement. "You two look like you're planning something," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that made Lucas's heart skip. Lucas touched the sandwich through his jacket. "I think it might be," he said, surprising himself with the truth of it. The following evening found Lucas pacing the kitchen with an energy that had been absent for months. He caught himself glancing toward the back door every few minutes, and when Ramon raised an eyebrow at his restlessness, Lucas pretended to be checking inventory. The sandwich from the night before sat untouched in his office refrigerator, too precious to eat and too meaningful to discard. "You're wound tighter than a spring tonight, chef," Ramon observed, sliding a perfect plate of pescado a la plancha across the pass. His weathered hands moved with the confidence of 15 years working beside Lucas. But his eyes held concern. "What's got you so jumpy?" Lucas forced himself to focus on the plate, though his mind kept drifting to the alley outside. "Just thinking about menu changes for next month," he lied, garnishing the fish with microgreens that would have made his younger self roll his eyes at their pretension. The truth was more complicated. He had spent the day thinking about Marisol's face in the flickering streetlight, the way she had offered her meal without hesitation or expectation of gratitude. In his world of transactional relationships and calculated generosity, her simple kindness felt revolutionary. During his afternoon break, he had walked the neighborhood surrounding the restaurant, ostensibly checking on suppliers but really hoping to catch a glimpse of her. The city suddenly felt different, layered with invisible lives he had never bothered to notice. How many people like Marisol moved through his neighborhood while he focused only on the narrow world of his kitchen? As the dinner service reached its peak, Lucas found excuses to step outside, first to check the evening's deliveries, then to ensure the dumpsters were properly positioned. Finally, he simply stood in the alley, smoking a cigarette he didn't want, and listening to the sounds of the city beyond his restaurant's walls. Looking for someone? Frankie appeared beside him, arms crossed against the October chill. The dishwasher was barely 20, with the kind of earnest ambition that reminded Lucas painfully of himself at that age. Despite working the least glamorous position in the kitchen, Frankie watched everything, absorbed every technique, and asked thoughtful questions during quiet moments. Lucas stubbed out his cigarette. "Just getting some air?" Frankie nodded, but his expression suggested he wasn't buying the explanation. "There's this girl," he said casually. "Comes around here sometimes. Real quiet, keeps to herself. I've seen her sitting on the fire escape across the street, writing in this little notebook." Lucas tried to keep his voice neutral. "What about her?" "Nothing bad," Frankie said quickly. "She seems nice, polite when I've said hello, but she's always alone, you know? Looks like she could use a friend." He glanced at Lucas sideways. "Or maybe a good meal." The implication hung in the air between them. Lucas wondered how transparent his interest had become, how many of his staff had noticed his distraction. But instead of embarrassment, he felt something like relief. Maybe caring about someone outside his professional circle wasn't weakness. Maybe it was exactly what had been missing. "She mentioned she writes stories," Lucas found himself saying. "Children's stories." Frankie's face lit up. "That's beautiful, chef. My little sister loves stories, always begging someone to read to her." He paused. "You think she'd mind if I said hello next time I see her? Just to be friendly?" The possessiveness that flared in Lucas's chest surprised him. He barely knew Marisol, had no claim on her time or attention, yet the thought of someone else approaching her felt wrong. But looking at Frankie's genuine enthusiasm, he recognized his own selfishness. "I think she'd appreciate kindness," Lucas said carefully, "but she seems cautious. Don't push." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the pedestrians pass by the alley's mouth. Lucas found himself scanning each figure, hoping to see Marisol's slight form emerge from the shadows. The city felt alive with possibility in a way it hadn't for years. A soft laugh made both men turn. Marisol stood at the edge of the alley, notebook clutched against her chest, watching them with amusement. "You two look like you're planning something," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that made Lucas's heart skip. "Just talking," Lucas said, stepping forward instinctively. In the better light, he could see details he had missed the night before. Her clothes were clean but worn, layered for warmth rather than style. Her boots had been resoled multiple times, and her jacket pocket was carefully mended with thread that didn't quite match. But her eyes were bright and alert, and when she smiled, her whole face transformed. "Thank you," he said, pulling the sandwich from his jacket, "for last night. I wanted to return this." Marisol shook her head, taking a step back. "I told you to keep it. Did you eat?" The question was so simple, so direct, that Lucas found himself smiling for the first time in weeks. "I was waiting for the right moment," he admitted. "Food's not meant for waiting," she said, echoing something Aunt Sophia used to tell him. "It's meant for sharing." Frankie cleared his throat gently. "I'm Frankie," he said, extending his hand to Marisol. "I work in the kitchen." She shook his hand cautiously. "Marisol, nice to meet you." "Lucas was telling me you write stories," Frankie continued, his enthusiasm genuine. "That's incredible. What kind of stories?" A faint blush colored Marisol's cheeks. "Just silly things," she said, hugging her notebook tighter. "Animal adventures mostly. Things that might make kids laugh." "My sister would love that," Frankie said. "She's 7, and she devours books like they're candy." For the next few minutes, they stood in the alley talking about stories and children and the magic of imagination. Lucas watched Marisol's face as she spoke about her writing, saw the passion that lit her features when she described a particularly clever rabbit or a wise old turtle. This was her element, he realized. Not the streets or the shelters, but the world of stories where anything was possible. When she finally said goodbye, promising nothing except that she might be around tomorrow, Lucas felt the familiar tug of anticipation. But this time, it wasn't the dread that had accompanied his days for months. It was hope, fragile and uncertain, but unmistakably real. Back in the kitchen, Ramon pulled him aside. "You seem different tonight," he said, his tone carefully neutral, more present. Lucas nodded, not trusting himself to explain. How could he tell his oldest friend that a homeless woman's kindness had cracked something open in his chest? That for the first time in years he was looking forward to tomorrow? "Maybe I'm remembering why I started cooking," he said finally. Ramon smiled, the expression reaching his eyes. "Good," he said. "It's about time." The third night brought rain. a steady October drizzle that turned the city's colors muted and soft. Lucas stood at the kitchen window, watching water streak down the glass, and wondered if Marisol had found somewhere dry to wait out the weather. The thought of her huddled in some doorway, notebook protected against her chest, made his stomach clench with worry. He had spent the afternoon preparing a container of caldo de pollo, the simple chicken soup Aunt Sophia had taught him to make when he was barely tall enough to reach the stove. Not the refined version he might serve at Corazon, elevated with exotic herbs and architectural presentation, but the real thing. Chicken slow-simmered with onions, carrots, and celery. Rice that had absorbed the broth until each grain was plump with flavor. Cilantro and lime added at the end, the way his aunt insisted was proper. "You're taking food home tonight?" Ramon asked, noticing the thermal container Lucas was packing. "Something like that," Lucas replied, wrapping the container in towels to keep it warm. He had told himself this was just kindness, returning the favor of the sandwich. But the care he had taken with the soup, tasting and adjusting the seasoning multiple times, suggested something deeper was taking root. The alley was empty when he first checked, water pooling in the uneven asphalt and reflecting the streetlight in fractured patterns. Lucas waited, feeling slightly foolish but unable to leave. What if she came and he wasn't there? What if she needed the warmth? 20 minutes later, Marisol appeared, emerging from the shadows like a figure from one of her own stories. She wore the same layered clothes as before, but now they were damp from the rain. Her notebook was wrapped in a plastic bag, protected against the weather with the dedication of someone who understood that some things were irreplaceable. "You're soaked," Lucas said, stepping forward instinctively. She shrugged, rainwater dripping from her ponytail. "Water dries, the city doesn't stop for weather." "I brought you something." He held out the container, steam still rising faintly from around the edges. "Soup. It's still hot." Marisol stared at the offering, and for a moment Lucas thought she might refuse. The careful walls she kept around herself were almost visible, the defenses of someone who had learned that accepting help often came with hidden costs. "What kind?" she asked finally. "Chicken. Nothing fancy. The kind that's supposed to make you feel better." She accepted the container, and when she lifted the lid, the rich aroma of the soup rose between them. Lucas watched her face as she breathed it in, saw the way her eyes closed briefly in appreciation. "It smells like home," she said softly. "Where's home for you?" Lucas asked, then immediately regretted the question when he saw her expression tighten. "Nowhere, everywhere." She settled onto the crate where he had sat 2 nights ago, balancing the soup carefully. "Home is where you make it, right?" Lucas leaned against the brick wall, giving her space while staying close enough to talk. "My aunt used to say that home was wherever the soup pot was simmering." A small smile touched Marisol's lips. "Smart woman, was she a good cook?" "The best. She ran a little cafe in Queens. Nothing fancy, just good food made with love. She taught me that cooking was about more than feeding people's bodies." Lucas surprised himself with how easily the words came. He hadn't talked about Aunt Sophia's lessons in years, too busy chasing stars and reviews to remember what had originally drawn him to the kitchen. "What else did she teach you?" Marisol asked, taking a careful spoonful of soup. Her eyes widened slightly at the taste, and Lucas felt a flush of pride that had nothing to do with professional achievement. "That every meal is a story. The ingredients, the hands that prepared them, the people who share them. She said you could taste love if you knew how to look for it." Marisol nodded thoughtfully. "I like that, food as story." She gestured toward her plastic-wrapped notebook. "I write stories about food sometimes, usually involving animals who go on adventures to find the perfect meal." "Tell me about one," Lucas said, settling more comfortably against the wall. She hesitated, then seemed to decide he was trustworthy. "There's this rabbit named Esperanza who lives in a garden behind a restaurant. She's always hungry, but instead of just eating the vegetables, she watches the cooks through the window and dreams about combining flavors. One day she decides to make her own feast. What does she cook? Carrot soup with mint from the herb garden, salad with edible flowers. Bread baked on a stone in the sun." Marisol's voice gained confidence as she spoke, her hands moving expressively despite holding the soup. "But the best part is when she invites all the other garden animals to share it. The old tomcat who usually chases her, the mice who steal crumbs, even the grumpy groundhog who complains about everything. Lucas found himself smiling, genuinely charmed by the story. And they all get along? Well, the cat still wants to chase the mice, and the groundhog still complains, but they're all too busy enjoying the food to fight. Esperanza realizes that the perfect meal isn't about the ingredients, it's about sharing it with others, even if they're different from you. The parallel wasn't lost on either of them. Here they were, a successful chef and a homeless woman, sharing soup in an alley while rain fell around them. Different worlds, different struggles, but somehow finding common ground in the simple act of nourishment. That's a beautiful story, Lucas said. Have you written it down? Marisol nodded, patting her notebook, along with about 50 others. I used to tell them to the kids at the library during story time before. She trailed off, and Lucas didn't push. They sat in comfortable silence while she finished the soup, the rain providing a gentle soundtrack to their thoughts. Lucas watched her eat, noting how she savored each spoonful instead of rushing through the meal. There was a mindfulness to her eating that he had lost somewhere in his climb to culinary fame, when food became performance rather than pleasure. "This is really good," she said, scraping the bottom of the container. "Your aunt taught you well." "She'd like you," Lucas said without thinking, then felt heat rise in his face at the presumption. But Marisol just smiled. "What makes you say that?" "She always said the best people were the ones who understood that kindness costs nothing but means everything. You proved that the other night." "Maybe we both did," Marisol replied, holding up the empty container. "This soup, it's not just food, it's care made visible." The phrase struck Lucas like lightning. Care made visible. That was what had been missing from his cooking, from his life. Somewhere along the way, he had forgotten that every dish was an opportunity to show love, every meal a chance to connect. He had been so focused on impressing critics and maintaining his reputation that he had stopped caring about the people he was actually feeding. When Marisol stood to leave, she hesitated. "Will you be here tomorrow?" she asked. "If you want me to be," Lucas replied. She considered this, studying his face in the uncertain light. "I think I'd like that," she said finally. After she disappeared into the rainy night, Lucas remained in the alley, feeling the weight of possibility settling around him like a warm coat. For the first time in months, he was eager to get to work tomorrow, not because of any review or reservation, but because he wanted to create something worthy of sharing with someone who understood that food was love made visible. He picked up the empty soup container, already planning what he might bring her next. Sunday afternoons at Aunt Sophia's apartment in Queens had been Lucas's sanctuary since childhood, and even now, at 41, he found himself drawn to her small kitchen with its mismatched chairs and the perpetual scent of sofrito simmering on the stove. The walls were covered with photographs spanning decades. Lucas at culinary school, receiving his first Michelin star, cutting the ribbon at Corazon's opening. But today, those images felt like artifacts from someone else's life. Sofia Moreno stood barely 5 feet tall, but her presence filled every corner of the cramped apartment. At 73, she moved through her kitchen with the same fluid grace that had made her cafe legendary among the neighborhood's working families. Her hair was silver now, pinned back in a neat bun, and her hands bore the calluses of 60 years spent chopping, stirring, and serving love on plates. "You look thin, Mijo," she said without preamble, ladling black beans and rice onto his plate with the authority of someone who had been feeding him since he was 8 years old. "Wait, Polito, when was the last time you ate something that wasn't made in your fancy restaurant?" Lucas accepted the plate, inhaling the familiar comfort of her simple, perfect cooking. "I eat fine, Tia." "You eat food. That's different from nourishment." She settled across from him with her own plate, studying his face with eyes that had seen him through every triumph and heartbreak of his adult life. "Tell me what's troubling you." For a moment, Lucas considered deflecting, maintaining the careful facade he wore for everyone else. But this was Sofia, who had raised him after his parents died in a car accident, who had taught him that food was love made manifest, who had never accepted anything less than complete honesty from him. "I met someone," he said, the words surprising him with their weight. Sofia's eyebrows rose, but she continued eating, waiting for him to elaborate. She had learned long ago that Lucas needed time to find his words when something mattered. A girl, a woman. He corrected himself, thinking of Marisol's careful dignity, the way she carried herself despite her circumstances. "She writes stories. Children's stories about animals who go on adventures." "And?" Sofia prompted gently. She's homeless. The word felt heavy in his mouth, laden with all the implications he was still trying to process. Living on the streets. But she gave me her sandwich, her only meal, because she thought I looked sad. Sophia set down her fork, giving him her complete attention. In the silence that followed, Lucas could hear the neighbor's television through the thin walls. The distant sound of children playing in the courtyard below. This apartment had always been a refuge from the noise of his professional life, a place where he could remember who he was beneath the accolades and expectations. "What did you do?" Sophia asked. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I brought her soup. We talked. She told me one of her stories. Lucas found himself smiling at the memory of Marisol's face lighting up as she described Esperanza the rabbit. "She has this way of seeing the world, Tia. Like everything is still possible, even when she has nothing. And now you want to help her." It wasn't a question, and Lucas nodded. "But I don't know how. Every time I think about offering her something, money, a place to stay, it feels wrong. Like I'd be taking something away from her instead of giving." Sophia reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Her skin was soft and warm, marked with the small scars that came from a lifetime of cooking. "What do you know about her story? Her family?" "Nothing, really. She doesn't talk about the past, just the present, and sometimes the stories she writes." "Then that's where you start," Sophia said firmly. "Not with what you think she needs, but with what she's willing to share. You don't save people, Lucas. You walk alongside them." The wisdom in her words resonated in his chest, settling into place like a missing piece of a puzzle he hadn't known he was trying to solve. "How do I know if I'm helping or just making myself feel better?" Sophia stood and moved to an old wooden chest in the corner of the living room. Lucas had seen her retrieve treasures from that chest throughout his childhood. Photographs, letters, small mementos that held the weight of memory. She returned with something wrapped in faded tissue paper. "Your mother gave this to me when she was pregnant with you," Sophia said, unwrapping a leather-bound notebook with pages yellowed by age. "She said every story deserved a proper home. She never got to use it, but I've been saving it for the right moment." Lucas accepted the notebook reverently, running his fingers over the supple leather cover. It was beautiful in its simplicity, the kind of journal that invited confidences and dreams. "If this girl writes stories, she needs a place to keep them safe," Sophia continued. "But giving this to her means you're committed to being part of her story, not just a generous stranger passing through. Are you ready for that?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications Lucas was only beginning to understand. Helping Marisol wasn't just about providing food or shelter. It was about showing up consistently, about proving that kindness could exist without conditions or expiration dates. "I think so," he said honestly, "but what if I let her down? What if I promise something I can't deliver?" Sophia smiled, the expression creasing her face in familiar lines. "Then you apologize. Learn from your mistakes and try again. That's what love looks like, Mijo. Not perfection, but persistence." They finished their meal in companionable silence, the notebook resting between them like a bridge to possibilities neither could fully envision. As Lucas prepared to leave, Sophia packed leftovers into containers with the automatic care of someone who had spent decades ensuring no one left her table hungry. "Bring her here sometime," she said as she walked him to the door. "I'd like to meet the girl who reminded my nephew how to see." Lucas hugged her, breathing in the familiar scent of vanilla and cinnamon that always clung to her clothes. "Thank you, Tia, for everything." "De nada, my love." Just remember, the best gifts aren't the ones that cost the most. They're the ones that show you've been paying attention. On the subway ride back to Manhattan, Lucas held the notebook carefully on his lap, feeling its weight and possibility. Through the window, the city rushed past in blurs of light and shadow, full of stories he had never bothered to notice. Tomorrow, he would offer Marisol not just food, but a place to preserve the stories that lived in her imagination. And maybe, if he was lucky, she would trust him enough to let him be part of whatever came next. The October wind carried the bite of approaching winter, as Lucas waited in the alley, the leather notebook tucked securely inside his jacket. He had arrived early, unable to concentrate on the evening service, with the weight of possibility pressing against his ribs. Through the kitchen window, he could see Ramon directing the line cooks with practiced efficiency, the restaurant running smoothly without his constant oversight. Once, that would have bothered him. Tonight, it felt like freedom. Marisol appeared just as the streetlight flickered to life, her slight figure materializing from the shadows between buildings like a character from one of her own stories. She moved with the careful awareness of someone who had learned to navigate the city's hidden dangers, but when she saw Lucas, her posture relaxed slightly. "You're early," she observed, settling onto the crate that had become their unofficial meeting place. "So are you," Lucas replied, noting the way she clutched her plastic-wrapped notebook against her chest. The gesture had become familiar to him, this protective stance that spoke of someone who had learned to guard what mattered most. The wind gusted between them, carrying the scent of rain and distant cooking. Marisol shivered, pulling her layered clothing tighter around her frame. Without thinking, Lucas shrugged out of his jacket and offered it to her. "I'm fine," she said automatically, but her eyes lingered on the warm wool. "I know you are," Lucas said gently, "but it's cold, and I just came from a hot kitchen. Let me help." She accepted the jacket with careful grace, wrapping it around her shoulders. It was too large for her frame, but the warmth was immediate and welcome. "Thank you." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of the city settling into evening rhythms. Lucas felt the notebook's weight against his side, and wondered how to bridge the gap between intention and action. Finally, he pulled it from his pocket, the leather warm from his body heat. "I brought you something," he said, extending the journal toward her. Marisol stared at the offering, her expression cycling through surprise, wariness, and something that might have been longing. "What is it?" "A notebook. For your stories." Lucas kept his voice careful, neutral. "The pages are blank, waiting for whatever you want to put there." She didn't reach for it immediately, and Lucas felt his heart sink. Had he overstepped? Presumed too much about their fragile connection? "It's beautiful," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't accept this." "Why not?" Marisol's hands twisted in her lap, the gesture revealing an internal struggle Lucas couldn't quite read. "Because people don't give gifts like this without expecting something back. And I don't have anything to give you." The words hit Lucas like a physical blow, revealing the careful calculus of survival that governed Marisol's world. Every kindness was analyzed for hidden costs, every gift examined for the debt it might create. How many times had she been hurt by people who offered help only to extract payment later? "I don't want anything from you," Lucas said, setting the notebook on the crate between them. "Except maybe the privilege of reading your stories someday, if you're willing to share them." "You don't understand," Marisol said, her voice gaining strength. "I've been burned before. People who want to help homeless girls, who make promises they don't keep, who disappear when helping gets complicated or inconvenient." Lucas felt the weight of her words, the accumulated disappointments that had taught her to view kindness with suspicion. "Tell me," he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment, as if measuring his capacity for truth. Then, slowly, she began to speak. "There was this social worker, Sarah. When I first ended up on the streets, she found me sleeping in a library bathroom. She was so kind, so concerned. Took me for coffee, listened to my story, promised she'd help me get back on my feet." Marisol's voice grew flat, recounting facts rather than feelings. "She got me into a transitional housing program, helped me apply for jobs. I thought maybe things were turning around." Lucas waited, sensing there was more. Then her caseload got reorganized. New supervisor, new priorities. Suddenly, she didn't have time for coffee dates or check-ins. "The housing program had a waiting list, and I wasn't priority enough to stay. Back to the streets, but now I'd gotten my hopes up. That hurt worse than never having help at all." The story settled between them like a stone in still water, its implications rippling outward. Lucas understood now why Marisol held herself so carefully, why every gesture of kindness was met with wariness. She had learned that help could disappear as quickly as it arrived, leaving her more vulnerable than before. "I'm not a social worker," Lucas said finally. "I'm just someone who met you in an alley and wants to know you better. No programs, no professional obligations. Just friendship if you're willing." Marisol studied his face in the uncertain light, searching for deception or hidden agenda. What happens when you get bored? When helping me stops feeling good and starts feeling like work. The question was fair, and Lucas respected her for asking it. I don't know, he admitted. I can't promise I'll never disappoint you because I'm human, and humans make mistakes. But I can promise that I won't just disappear. If something changes, if I can't keep showing up the way you need, I'll tell you. I won't just vanish and leave you wondering what you did wrong. It was a small promise, perhaps, but Lucas meant it completely. Marisol seemed to sense his sincerity because she picked up the notebook, running her fingers over the leather cover. It belonged to my mother, Lucas said softly. My aunt gave it to me today, said every story deserves a proper home. Tears gathered in Marisol's eyes, though she blinked them back quickly. Your mother's? She died when I was 8, never got to use it. But I think she'd like knowing it was helping someone tell stories again. Marisol opened the notebook, revealing pages of cream-colored paper, each one pristine and full of possibility. It's too precious, she whispered. Stories are precious, Lucas replied. They deserve precious things to live in. She closed the notebook carefully, holding it against her chest the way she held her old battered journal. Thank you, she said, the words carrying more weight than their simplicity suggested. Will you write something in it? Lucas asked. Before I see you again? A small smile crossed Marisol's face, the first truly unguarded expression he had seen from her. I might already have something in mind. As she prepared to leave, wrapping his jacket more tightly around her shoulders, Lucas felt a shift in the air between them. Not the completion of something, but the beginning. The notebook was more than a gift. It was a bridge, a statement of faith in her stories and her future. Same time tomorrow? He asked. Marisol nodded, clutching the notebook like a talisman. Same time tomorrow. After she disappeared into the maze of city streets, Lucas remained in the alley, feeling something he hadn't experienced in years. The deep satisfaction of giving a gift that truly mattered. Not the calculated generosity of charity events or business relationships, but the pure joy of offering something precious to someone who would treasure it. The evening service at Corazon hummed with its usual controlled chaos, but Lucas found his attention drifting to the back door more frequently than ever. 3 days had passed since he'd given Marisol the notebook, and each night he had waited in the alley, hoping to see what she might have written. She hadn't appeared, and the absence felt like a weight in his chest. Chef, you're burning the plantains, Frankie called out, sliding past with a stack of clean plates balanced expertly in his arms. Lucas snapped back to attention, rescuing the sweet bananas from the sauté pan just before they crossed the line from caramelized to charred. Frankie was right. His mind had been elsewhere, caught between worry and anticipation. Where was Marisol? Had the notebook been too much, too presumptuous? Had he scared her away with the weight of his gesture? Thanks, Lucas muttered, plating the plantains with more care than they deserved. The dinner rush was winding down, only a few tables left to serve, but he felt restless, unable to focus on the familiar rhythms of service. Frankie appeared at his elbow again, this time with the focused expression that meant he had something on his mind. Chef, can I ask you something? Lucas nodded, grateful for the distraction. That girl you've been talking to, Marisol? I saw her earlier today sitting on the fire escape across the street. She looked upset. Lucas's attention sharpened. Upset how? Like she'd been crying. She was just sitting there, staring at this notebook. A fancy one. Leather-bound. Frankie's young face creased with concern. I wanted to say something, but she seemed like she needed space. The description sent a chill through Lucas. The notebook. His mother's notebook, Aunt Sophia's gift, his offering of trust and connection. Had it somehow caused Marisol pain instead of joy? Did you see where she went? Lucas asked. That's the thing. She's still out there. Been sitting in the same spot for hours. It's getting cold, and she doesn't have a jacket or anything. Frankie hesitated, then continued with the earnestness that made him so endearing. I was thinking maybe we could invite her in, just for some coffee, something warm. I know it's not exactly protocol, but... Lucas felt a surge of affection for the young dishwasher. Despite working the least glamorous job in the kitchen, Frankie possessed an intuitive kindness that reminded Lucas why he had fallen in love with the hospitality industry in the first place. The desire to care for people, to offer comfort and nourishment, was supposed to be at the heart of everything they did. "You're right," Lucas said, untying his apron. "Let's go talk to her." They slipped out the back door together, and Lucas immediately spotted Marisol on the fire escape of the building across the narrow street. She sat with her knees drawn up to her chest, the leather notebook open in her lap, her face illuminated by the yellow glow of a streetlight. Even from a distance, he could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she held herself. "Marisol," Lucas called softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, and even in the uncertain light, he could see that Frankie had been right. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her cheeks blotchy with tears. She closed the notebook quickly, as if hiding something shameful. "Hey," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "I was just getting some air." "On a fire escape?" Frankie asked gently, already crossing the street toward her. "That's dedication to fresh air." Despite herself, Marisol smiled slightly. "It's quiet up here. Good place to think." Lucas joined them at the base of the building, looking up at her perched above them like a bird that might take flight at any sudden movement. "Want to come down and think somewhere warmer? Frankie makes excellent coffee." "The best in Queens," Frankie added with mock seriousness. "I learned from my grandmother, and she learned from her grandmother. It's a sacred family tradition." Marisol's smile grew more genuine. "That's quite a pedigree." "Plus, I just made fresh bread," Frankie continued. "Nothing fancy, just focaccia with rosemary and sea salt. It's still warm." Lucas watched the internal struggle play out across Marisol's face. The offer was clearly tempting. Warmth, food, company. But he could see her walls reasserting themselves, the careful defenses that kept her safe. "I don't want to intrude," she said finally. "You wouldn't be," Lucas said simply. "The restaurant's closed to customers, but the kitchen's still alive. It's where the real conversations happen anyway." Slowly, carefully, Marisol climbed down the fire escape. When she reached the bottom, Lucas could see that she clutched the notebook against her chest like a shield. Whatever she had written in it, whatever had made her cry, she wasn't ready to share. The kitchen after service had always been Lucas's favorite time, the controlled chaos replaced by the gentle rhythm of cleanup and preparation for tomorrow. A few line cooks were finishing their closing duties, but the space felt intimate and welcoming rather than industrial. Frankie busied himself making coffee, his movements efficient and practiced. The espresso machine hissed and gurgled, filling the air with rich, bitter aromas that mixed with the lingering scents of the evening service. He produced a loaf of focaccia from the bread station, still fragrant with herbs and olive oil. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a small table in the corner where the staff usually took their breaks. "This is the best seat in the house. You can see everything, but you're out of the way of the work." Marisol settled into the chair cautiously, the notebook still pressed against her chest. Lucas took the seat across from her, noting the way her eyes darted around the kitchen, taking in the professional equipment, the organized chaos of a working restaurant. "This is your place?" she asked, her voice small in the large space. "It is," Lucas confirmed. "Have you ever been in a restaurant kitchen before?" She shook her head. "Only fast food places, when I was working. Nothing like this." Frankie appeared with 3 cups of coffee and thick slices of the warm bread, drizzled with olive oil and sprinkled with coarse salt. The simple presentation felt more honest than the elaborate plating they did for customers, more in keeping with the kind of nourishment Lucas remembered from Aunt Sophia's kitchen. "So," Frankie said, settling into the third chair with the easy confidence of someone young enough to find most situations naturally comfortable, "what kind of stories do you write?" Marisol took a sip of coffee, and Lucas saw some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Children's stories, mostly. Adventures about animals who learn important lessons." "Like what kind of lessons?" Frankie pressed, genuinely curious. "How to be brave when you're scared. How to help others even when you don't have much. How to find family in unexpected places." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, the passion for her craft overriding her natural caution. Lucas listened, struck by how perfectly her themes aligned with the situation they found themselves in. Here was Marisol showing bravery by accepting their invitation despite her fears. Here they were, offering help despite being strangers. Here, in this unlikely combination of people and circumstances, something like family was forming. "That sounds beautiful," Frankie said. "I'd love to read some of them sometime, if you're willing to share." Marisol's grip on the notebook tightened slightly. "Maybe someday," she said, but her tone suggested that someday might be closer than Lucas had dared hope. They sat in comfortable silence, sharing bread and coffee while the kitchen settled into its nighttime quiet around them. For the first time in months, Lucas felt the deep satisfaction that came from true hospitality, not the performance of service, but the genuine pleasure of caring for someone who needed it. When Marisol finally stood to leave, she moved more slowly than usual, as if reluctant to return to the cold street. "Thank you," she said, the words carrying weight beyond mere politeness. "For the coffee, the bread, the warmth." "Thank you for letting us share it with you," Lucas replied, meaning every word. As she reached the door, Marisol paused and looked back. "I wrote something," she said softly, touching the notebook. "In here. It's not finished yet, but maybe next time I could read a little of it, if you want to hear it." Lucas felt his heart lift. "I'd like that very much." After she disappeared into the night, Frankie began cleaning up their impromptu gathering. "She's nice," he said simply, "different from what I expected." "What did you expect?" Lucas asked. Frankie shrugged. "I don't know. Someone harder, maybe? More bitter? But she's got this gentleness about her, like she's seen bad things, but hasn't let them make her mean." It was a remarkably astute observation from someone so young, and it crystallized something Lucas had been feeling but couldn't articulate. Marisol's resilience wasn't the brittle kind that came from building walls. It was the flexible strength of someone who had learned to bend without breaking. "Thanks for thinking of inviting her in," Lucas said. "Thanks for letting me," Frankie replied. "It felt good, you know? Using the kitchen the way it's supposed to be used." Lucas nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Tonight, they had remembered that food was about more than flavor profiles and presentation. It was about creating connection, offering comfort, and making people feel like they belonged somewhere, even if only for a little while. The restaurant had settled into its after-midnight quiet when Lucas unlocked the back door to find Marisol waiting in the alley, the leather notebook clutched against her chest like a talisman. 3 weeks had passed since Frankie's invitation had first brought her into the kitchen, and these late-night meetings had become a rhythm that anchored Lucas's days. Tonight felt different, though. There was an anticipation in the air, a sense of crossing some invisible threshold. "You're later than usual," Marisol observed, though her tone held no complaint. "Difficult customer," Lucas explained, stepping aside to let her enter. "Sent back the same dish 3 times, each time with a different complaint. Ramon finally suggested they might be happier at McDonald's." A laugh escaped Marisol before she could stop it, the sound bright and surprising in the narrow alley. "Did they leave?" "Stormed out muttering about Yelp reviews and how we'd never survive their 1-star rating." Lucas found himself smiling at the memory. A month ago, such a scene would have sent him spiraling into anxiety about reputation and revenue. Tonight, it felt merely absurd. Inside the kitchen, Lucas moved through the familiar ritual of preparing their late-night meal. Not the elaborate presentation served to paying customers, but the honest food that reminded him why he had fallen in love with cooking. Tonight, he had planned something special, a rose con polo made exactly the way Aunt Sophia had taught him, with saffron that turned the rice golden and chicken that fell off the bone. "It smells like memories," Marisol said, settling into what had become her usual chair at the small staff table. The notebook remained in her lap, but her grip had loosened over the weeks, and sometimes she even set it aside while they ate. "That's what my aunt always said good food should do," Lucas replied, stirring the rice gently to prevent it from sticking. "Transport you somewhere else, someone else, make you remember what it felt like to be loved." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than he had intended. Lucas felt heat rise in his cheeks. When had he become so comfortable revealing these intimate truths to her? But Marisol simply nodded, as if she understood exactly what he meant. "I remember the first time someone cooked for me after I ended up on the streets," she said quietly. "This woman named Clara who ran a soup kitchen in the village. She made this incredible vegetable stew, but it wasn't just the food, it was the way she served it. Like we were guests at her table instead of charity cases." Lucas plated the arroz con polo with the same care he would give a paying customer, but with none of the architectural pretension. Just honest portions of fragrant rice studded with tender chicken, scattered with peas and strips of red pepper that caught the kitchen's fluorescent light like confetti. "Clara sounds like someone special," he said, setting the plate before her. "She is." Marisol accepted the fork he offered, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "She's the one who encouraged me to keep writing, even when everything else felt impossible. Said stories were the one thing no one could take away from you." They ate in comfortable silence for several minutes, the only sounds, the gentle scrape of forks against plates, and the distant hum of the walk-in refrigerator. Lucas watched Marisol savor each bite, noting the way she chewed slowly, deliberately, as if storing the flavors in some internal archive of good moments. "I finished the story," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas looked up from his plate, heart quickening. "The one you mentioned? About the rabbit?" "No, a different one." Marisol's hands moved to the notebook, her fingers tracing patterns on the leather cover. "I wrote it in your mother's journal, about a chef who forgot why he loved cooking." The words sent a jolt through Lucas's chest. He set down his fork, giving her his complete attention. "Will you read it to me?" She hesitated, and Lucas could see the familiar war between desire and self-protection playing out across her features. Sharing her writing meant revealing pieces of her soul, making herself vulnerable in ways that went beyond accepting food or shelter. "It's not very good," she said finally, the disclaimer that every artist offered before baring their heart. "I'd still like to hear it," Lucas said gently, "if you're willing to share." Marisol opened the notebook, her hands trembling slightly as she found the right page. When she began to read, her voice was soft but clear, carrying the cadence of someone who understood the rhythm of storytelling. "Once upon a time, in a kitchen full of stars, there lived a chef who had forgotten the taste of his own cooking. Every day he prepared beautiful dishes for people who praised his skill, but he could no longer remember why he had started cooking in the first place. The food had no flavor for him, and his heart had grown as cold as his walk-in freezer." Lucas felt his breath catch. The parallels were unmistakable. But there was something in Marisol's telling that elevated the story beyond mere autobiography. She had taken his pain and transformed it into something universal, something that spoke to anyone who had lost their way. One night when the chef was feeling particularly empty, he met a sparrow who was even hungrier than he was. The sparrow offered to share her only crumb of bread, even though she had been flying for days without food. The chef was so moved by her generosity that he invited the sparrow into his kitchen. Marisol's voice grew stronger as she continued, the story unfolding with the logic of fairy tales where kindness was always rewarded and hearts could be mended through connection. The chef in her story began cooking simple meals for the sparrow, rediscovering his passion through the joy of nourishing someone who truly needed it. Together they cooked soup that tasted like comfort and bread that smelled like home. The chef learned that the most important ingredient wasn't technique or expensive spices, it was caring about the person who would eat the food. And the sparrow learned that sometimes accepting help was its own kind of gift, because it allowed someone else to remember their purpose. When she finished reading, silence filled the kitchen like a held breath. Lucas felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, moved not just by the story itself but by the generosity of Marisol's perception. She had seen through his professional facade to the man beneath, the one who had lost his way in the pursuit of external validation. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "Is that really how you see me, as someone who forgot why he loved cooking?" Marisol closed the notebook carefully, meeting his eyes for the first time since she had begun reading. "I see someone who's remembering," she said softly. "The way you cook now, when it's just us, it's different from what I imagine you do for the restaurant. More honest." The observation hit home with uncomfortable accuracy. Lucas realized that these late-night meals with Marisol had become the most satisfying cooking he had done in years. No pressure to impress, no need to prove his worth through complexity or innovation. Just the simple pleasure of nourishing someone who appreciated every bite. "You're right," he admitted. "I had lost it, somewhere along the way. The joy, the purpose, everything became about reviews and reputation instead of this." He gestured around the quiet kitchen, at the shared meal between them. "Connection." "The sparrow in my story," Marisol said, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "She was afraid to trust the chef at first, worried he might lose interest once helping her stop feeling good." "And what happened to change her mind?" He kept showing up, she said simply. Night after night, without asking for anything in return, until she realized that maybe they were helping each other. The truth of it settled between them like a bridge finally completed. They had been helping each other, Lucas realized. Marisol's stories had reminded him of the magic in simple generosity, while his consistent presence had given her a safe place to share the creativity that sustained her. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate for everything he wanted to express, "for seeing me so clearly and for writing it down so beautifully." "Thank you for giving me a reason to write again," she replied, "and for teaching me that some kitchens are warm enough to heal what's broken." As they finished their meal, Lucas felt something shift in his chest. Not the completion of healing, but the beginning of it. Tomorrow he would return to the demands of running Corazon, to the pressure of maintaining standards and exceeding expectations. But now he would carry with him the memory of this moment, of honest food shared with someone who understood that nourishment was about more than filling empty stomachs. Outside, the city continued its restless sleep, but in this small corner of warmth and light, two damaged souls had found something precious, the courage to be seen completely and the grace to offer the same gift in return. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows of Corazon, casting long shadows across the stainless steel surfaces as Lucas prepped vegetables for the evening service. 3 weeks had passed since Marisol had read him her story about the chef and the sparrow, and their late-night meetings had become the anchor point around which his days revolved. He found himself cooking with renewed passion, each dish infused with the warmth he felt when imagining sharing it with her. "You're humming," Ramon observed, sliding past with a hotel pan full of mise en place. "I haven't heard you hum in years." Lucas paused, realizing his sous chef was right. When had melody returned to his movements? When had the kitchen stopped feeling like a stage and started feeling like home again? "Good mood," he said simply, returning to his knife work with the fluid precision that had made him famous. "Must be some mood," Ramon replied, but his tone held approval rather than curiosity. He had watched Lucas retreat into himself for months, and whatever was bringing light back to his friend's eyes was welcome, regardless of its source. The lunch service passed smoothly, a ballet of coordinated movement that Lucas conducted with renewed energy. But as the afternoon lull settled over the restaurant, he noticed Frankie hovering near the dish pit, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by something that looked like worry. "What's on your mind?" Lucas asked, joining the young dishwasher at his station. Frankie glanced around the kitchen, then leaned closer. "It's about Marisol," he said quietly. "I was taking trash to the dumpster this morning and I saw her talking to some guy near the coffee shop on Bleecker. She looked upset." Lucas felt his chest tighten. "Upset how?" "Like scared upset. The guy was well-dressed, older, kept trying to touch her arm while she backed away. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but her body language," Frankie shook his head. "She kept shaking her head, no, and he kept pushing." A protective instinct Lucas hadn't known he possessed flared to life. "Did you intervene?" "By the time I dropped the trash and got over there, he was gone. But Marisol just stood there for like 10 minutes, staring at the ground. When I asked if she was okay, she said she was fine, but—" Frankie shrugged helplessly. "She didn't look fine." Lucas nodded, his mind already shifting into problem-solving mode. Who was this man? What did he want with Marisol? And why hadn't she mentioned it during their meeting last night? "Thanks for telling me," he said. "I'll check on her tonight." But Frankie's expression suggested there was more. "Chef, there's something else. While I was talking to her, I saw her drop something, a magazine or newspaper. When I picked it up to give it back, I saw—" He paused, looking uncomfortable. "What?" "It was a copy of Food and Wine from last year. The issue with your photo on the cover, the one about rising star chefs. It was folded open to your article." The words hit Lucas like cold water. Marisol had been carrying around an article about him? How long had she known who he really was? And if she knew, why hadn't she said anything? The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. Lucas tried to focus on prep work and staff meetings, but his mind kept returning to the implications of Frankie's discovery. Had Marisol been playing some kind of game? Was their connection built on deception? Or had she simply been afraid to confront him with her knowledge? By the time evening service ended, Lucas was wound tight with anxiety and questions. He made his way to the alley earlier than usual, hoping to catch Marisol before she could slip away again. The October air bit sharp and clean, carrying the promise of winter on its edges. She was there, sitting on their usual crate, but something was different. Her posture was rigid, defensive, and she clutched the leather notebook against her chest like armor. When she looked up at his approach, her eyes held a mixture of hurt and accusation that made his stomach drop. "You lied to me," she said without preamble, her voice flat and careful. Lucas felt the bottom drop out of his world. Marisol, Lucas Moreno. She pulled the folded magazine from her jacket pocket, letting it fall open to reveal his photograph. Younger, more confident, accepting some culinary award with a smile that felt like it belonged to a stranger. Corazon's wonderkind chef, Michelin stars, James Beard Award winner, rising star of modern Latin cuisine. Each accolade felt like an accusation in her mouth. Lucas sank onto the adjacent crate, the weight of his omission crushing down on him. "When were you going to tell me?" Marisol continued, her voice gaining strength. "When were you going to mention that you're not just some line cook, being kind to a homeless girl, that you're the owner of this place, that you're famous, that helping me is probably just another charity case for your conscience?" "It's not like that," Lucas said desperately. "I never meant to deceive you. I wanted you to know me, not my reputation." "But your reputation is part of who you are." Marisol stood abruptly, pacing the narrow confines of the alley like a caged animal. "Do you know how this feels? Finding out that someone you trusted has been lying to you, that every conversation we've had has been built on a lie?" "I haven't been lying," Lucas protested. "Everything I've told you about myself, about my past, about why I cook, all of that is true. The only thing I didn't tell you was how successful the restaurant is." "Only?" Marisol's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Only that you're rich and famous and I'm just some street girl you decided to adopt as a project." The words stung because they echoed his own worst fears about his motivations. Was he helping Marisol because he genuinely cared about her, or because it made him feel better about his privileged position? "You're not a project," he said quietly. "You're my friend, the first real friend I've had in years." "Friends don't lie to each other." Marisol's voice cracked slightly, revealing the hurt beneath her anger. "Friends don't let each other believe things that aren't true." Lucas stood, taking a step toward her, but she backed away, maintaining the distance between them. "You're right," he said. "I should have told you from the beginning. I was afraid that if you knew who I was, you'd treat me differently, that you'd see the chef instead of the man. And I was afraid that if I told you I knew, you'd realize I wasn't worth your time." Marisol shot back. "Do you see how messed up this is? We've both been so busy protecting ourselves that we forgot to trust each other." The truth of her words settled between them like a chasm neither knew how to cross. Lucas felt the fragile connection they had built over weeks of shared meals and stories crumbling under the weight of mutual deception. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Since the second week. I saw your picture in the staff break room, on some magazine cover. I tried to pretend it didn't matter, that it didn't change anything, but—" She shrugged helplessly. "It changed everything. Every kindness felt like pity. Every meal felt like charity." "It was never pity," Lucas said with quiet intensity. "Not once. You saved me, Marisol. That first night, when you gave me your sandwich, you reminded me why I started cooking in the first place. Because food is love, and sharing it is the most human thing we can do." "But you're not just some regular person sharing food," Marisol said, her voice rising. "You're a celebrity chef with Michelin stars. You could help me, because it costs you nothing. A sandwich, some soup, a notebook. What's that to someone who makes thousands of dollars a night?" The accusation hung in the air between them, sharp and painful. Lucas felt something inside him break, not from anger, but from the realization that their different worlds had created a gulf he might not be able to bridge. "You're right," he said finally. "I do have more resources than you. I can afford to be generous in ways you can't. But that doesn't make my feelings less real, or my gratitude less genuine." Marisol was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the uncertain light. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller, more vulnerable. "I need to think," she said, "about all of this, about whether we can trust each other enough to keep going." She turned to leave, then paused. "The story I wrote about the chef and the sparrow, I wrote it after I found out who you were. I was trying to understand whether you were helping me because you cared, or because it made you feel better about having so much when I have so little." "And what did you decide?" Lucas asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. I decided it didn't matter, she said softly. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe it matters more than anything. After she disappeared into the maze of city streets, Lucas remained in the alley, feeling like he had lost something precious through his own cowardice. The notebook she had left behind lay on the crate, closed and silent, holding stories he might never get to hear. 5 days passed without any sign of Marisol, and Lucas felt her absence like a constant ache. He found himself stepping into the alley multiple times each evening, hoping to see her slight figure emerge from the shadows, but the space remained empty, save for the usual urban detritus of discarded newspapers and scattered leaves. The notebook sat on his office desk, a silent rebuke to his cowardice and a reminder of trust broken. The restaurant continued its nightly rhythm around him, but Lucas moved through the familiar choreography like a sleepwalker. Ramon noticed his distraction immediately, stepping in to manage the line when Lucas burned a batch of plantains or overseasoned a sauce. Even Frankie, usually cheerful and chatty, had grown subdued, occasionally glancing toward the back door as if expecting Marisol to materialize. "You need to eat something," Ramon said during a quiet moment in prep, sliding a plate of ropa vieja across the pass. "You've been picking at food for days." Lucas stared at the shredded beef, swimming in its rich tomato-based sauce, and felt nothing. Food had lost its comfort, its ability to anchor him. How could he have been so stupid? Marisol had trusted him with her stories, her vulnerability, her fragile hope for connection, and he had repaid her with deception. "I fucked up, Ramon," he said quietly, the admission scraping his throat raw. His sous chef leaned against the stainless steel counter, studying Lucas with the penetrating gaze of someone who had known him for 15 years. "Want to talk about it?" Lucas found himself spilling the whole story: the sandwich in the alley, the growing connection, his decision to hide his identity, Marisol's discovery of the truth. Ramon listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions, but never interrupting the flow of confession. "So she knows you're the big-shot chef, and you know she knows, and now you're both hiding from each other?" Ramon summarized when Lucas finished. "Something like that." "Jesus, Lucas, for smart people, you're both acting pretty stupid." The blunt assessment stung, but Lucas couldn't argue with its accuracy. "I don't know how to fix it. She doesn't trust me anymore, and I can't blame her. I should have told her from the beginning." "Yeah, you should have," Ramon agreed. "But you didn't, and now you have to deal with the consequences. Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Lucas pushed the untouched plate away, his appetite non-existent. "What can I do? She made it clear she needs space to think. I have to respect that." "Respecting her space doesn't mean doing nothing," Ramon said. "It means showing her that your feelings are real, even if your approach was wrong." Over the next 2 days, Lucas began to put Ramon's advice into action, though not in any way Marisol would immediately recognize. He researched homeless shelters in the village, particularly ones that served women, and arranged for anonymous donations of food, not elaborate restaurant leftovers, but simple, nourishing meals that could feed families. Containers of arroz con pollo, hearty vegetable soups, fresh bread that filled bellies and provided comfort. He visited the public library where Marisol had mentioned doing story time for children, speaking quietly with the librarian about starting a program for at-risk youth. When she mentioned they desperately needed supplies, notebooks, pencils, art materials, Lucas arranged for anonymous donations, wondering if Marisol might somehow benefit from the expanded resources. But his most deliberate gesture came when he remembered Marisol mentioning Clara, the woman who ran the soup kitchen in the village. It took Lucas 3 phone calls to track her down, and when he finally reached her, he felt nervous as a teenager asking for a first date. "This is going to sound strange," he said into his office phone, "but I have a friend named Marisol who spoke very highly of your work. I'm wondering if you might need any help with food donations." Clara's voice was warm but cautious. "We always need help, but most restaurants don't want to deal with the liability issues of donating prepared food." "I'm not most restaurants," Lucas said. "And I'm not looking for tax write-offs or publicity. I just want to help feed people who need it." They arranged for Lucas to visit the soup kitchen the following afternoon. The facility was smaller than he had expected, tucked into the basement of a community center with linoleum floors and folding tables that had seen better decades. But it was clean and welcoming, with hand-drawn children's artwork taped to the walls and the pervasive smell of something hearty simmering in industrial-sized pots. Clara turned out to be a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and hands that spoke of decades spent chopping vegetables and stirring soup. She took one look at Lucas in his expensive jacket and raised an eyebrow. "You're that chef, aren't you? The one with the fancy restaurant in Soho?" Lucas felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Does that matter?" "Depends on why you're here," Clara said bluntly. "We get a lot of wealthy folks who want to volunteer around the holidays, take some pictures for their social media, then disappear until next Christmas. Are you looking to feel good about yourself, or are you looking to do good?" The question echoed uncomfortably with Marisol's accusations, and Lucas realized this was a test he desperately needed to pass. "I'm looking to help consistently," he said. "No cameras, no publicity, just food for people who need it." Clara studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, let me show you around." The tour was brief but illuminating. The kitchen was basic but functional, serving up to 200 meals a day, with a staff of 3 paid employees and a rotating cast of volunteers. They focused on nutritious, filling food rather than gourmet presentations, exactly the kind of cooking that had originally drawn Lucas to the profession. "We serve breakfast at 8, lunch at noon, and dinner at 6, Clara explained as they returned to her small office. "Weekends are busiest, but we're open every day. Some of our regulars have been coming here for years." "Is Marisol one of your regulars?" Lucas asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Clara's expression sharpened. "You know Marisol?" We're friends. It's complicated." Clara leaned back in her chair, reassessing him. "She's been coming here off and on for about 8 months. Smart girl. Too proud for her own good sometimes. Hasn't been in recently, though. I was starting to worry." Lucas felt a pang of guilt. Had his revelation driven Marisol away from one of her few reliable sources of support? "If you see her," he said carefully, "would you tell her that someone is thinking about her, and that the soup kitchen has some new resources that might interest her?" Clara's smile was knowing. "I'll tell her. But Lucas, whatever happened between you two, fix it. Marisol doesn't trust easily, but when she does, it means something. Don't waste that gift." That evening, Lucas prepared an especially careful selection of food for the soup kitchen. Containers of sancocho, thick with vegetables and tender meat, fresh bread, and rice pudding studded with cinnamon and raisins. He delivered it personally, staying to help serve the dinner crowd, ladling soup and slicing bread with the same attention he gave to his restaurant's most discerning customers. As he worked, he found himself scanning the faces of the diners, hoping to catch a glimpse of Marisol's familiar features. She didn't appear, but something else happened that surprised him. He began to remember why he had fallen in love with cooking in the first place. Not the pursuit of perfection or acclaim, but the simple satisfaction of nourishing people who needed it. "You're a natural at this," Clara observed as they cleaned up after service. "Most fancy chefs who volunteer here treat it like slumming. You actually seem to care." "I do care," Lucas said, surprised by how much he meant it. "This feels more like cooking than anything I've done in years." Clara nodded approvingly. "That's what Marisol said about your food. She told me about some chef who had forgotten why he loved cooking, and how he was learning to remember." The reference to Marisol's story about the chef and the sparrow sent a jolt through Lucas's chest. She'd shared their story with Clara, which meant their connection had mattered to her, regardless of how it had ended. "Did she say anything else?" he asked. "Just that sometimes the people who seem to have everything are the hungriest of all," Clara replied. "And that kindness works both ways, even when the people involved don't realize it." Walking back to his restaurant through the village streets, Lucas felt something shift in his chest. Not the resolution he craved, but the beginning of understanding. Marisol was right to be angry about his deception, but their connection had been real. The question now was whether he could prove that his feelings had been genuine, regardless of the circumstances that had created them. The notebook still sat on his desk when he returned to Corazon, holding stories he might never get to hear. But for the first time in days, Lucas felt something other than despair. He felt purpose, and the quiet determination to keep showing up, even if Marisol never gave him the chance to explain. The first Saturday of November brought an unexpected warmth to the city, as if autumn was offering one last gift before surrendering to winter's embrace. Lucas stood in the community center's basement kitchen, chopping vegetables alongside Clara and 3 other volunteers, preparing for the evening meal service. 2 weeks had passed since he had started volunteering at the soup kitchen, and the rhythm of communal cooking had become a meditation that steadied his restless heart. "Hand me that onion," called Maria, a retired teacher who had been volunteering here longer than anyone could remember. And don't dice it so fine. We're feeding working folks, not food critics. Lucas smiled, adjusting his knife work to produce the rustic, generous cuts that Clara preferred. Here, in this basement kitchen with its mismatched pots and temperamental burner, he had rediscovered something he had lost in the pursuit of culinary perfection, the pure joy of feeding people who needed it. The prep work continued in comfortable camaraderie, volunteers sharing stories and gentle jokes while their hands moved through familiar motions. Lucas found himself thinking about Marisol, as he did during every quiet moment. Clara had mentioned seeing her twice in the past week, but always when Lucas wasn't there, as if she were deliberately avoiding him while still accepting the help he provided through the kitchen. "Chef Lucas," Clara called from across the kitchen, using the title with gentle mockery. "We've got a special request tonight. Some of the kids want to help serve, and I thought you might organize a little cooking demonstration. Nothing fancy, just show them how to make something simple they can do at home." The suggestion sparked an idea that had been forming in Lucas's mind for days. "What about storytelling instead?" he asked. "Or alongside the cooking? I know someone who writes wonderful children's stories about food and friendship." Clara's expression grew knowing. "Is this someone we both know?" "Maybe, if she's willing." Lucas wiped his hands on his apron, feeling the flutter of possibility in his chest. "There's this story about a rabbit named Esperanza who learns to cook for her friends. It's perfect for kids, and it teaches them about sharing and acceptance." "Sounds like exactly what we need," Clara said, "but you'll have to ask the storyteller yourself. I'm not playing matchmaker for you two." As if summoned by their conversation, footsteps echoed on the basement stairs. Lucas looked up to see Marisol descending slowly, the leather notebook tucked under her arm. She wore the same layered clothing he remembered, but something about her posture seemed different, less guarded, though still cautious. Their eyes met across the kitchen, and Lucas felt his heart stutter. She looked tired, perhaps thinner than before, but her gaze held a steady determination that hadn't been there during their last confrontation. "Clara said you might need help with the children's program tonight," Marisol said, addressing the room generally but keeping her attention focused on Lucas. "We do," Clara replied, though she busied herself with stirring a pot of soup to give them space. "Lucas here was just suggesting we add some storytelling to the cooking demonstration." Marisol's grip tightened on the notebook. "What kind of stories?" "The kind about rabbits who learn to cook for their friends," Lucas said quietly, "if the author is willing to share them." A long moment passed, in which the rest of the kitchen seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them standing across a space that felt both vast and intimate. Finally, Marisol nodded. "I think that could work," she said. The evening service began at 6, and by that time, a dozen children ranging from 5 to 12 had gathered around the prep table that Clara had cleared for the demonstration. Their faces, bright with curiosity and the promise of hot food, reminded Lucas why he had fallen in love with hospitality in the first place. "Tonight we're going to make something very special," Lucas announced, his voice carrying the warmth that had been missing from his professional presentations for months. "We're going to make friendship soup, and while we cook, Marisol is going to tell us a story about a very clever rabbit." The children settled into a semicircle, some sitting on overturned milk crates, others cross-legged on the clean floor. Marisol perched on a folding chair, the notebook open in her lap, and when she began to speak, her voice carried the same magic Lucas remembered from their late-night meetings in the alley. "Once upon a time, in a garden behind a restaurant, there lived a rabbit named Esperanza." As the story unfolded, Lucas moved through the simple steps of making vegetable soup, involving the children in washing carrots, peeling potatoes, and adding ingredients to the pot. But his attention was divided between the cooking and the sound of Marisol's voice, the way she brought Esperanza to life with subtle changes in tone and gesture. The children were entranced, gasping at the right moments and giggling when Esperanza accidentally invited the grumpy groundhog to dinner. When the rabbit finally served her feast to all the garden animals, teaching them that sharing food could turn enemies into friends, the soup was ready, filling the room with its comforting aroma. And that's how Esperanza learned that the most important ingredient in any recipe is the love you put into it, Marisol concluded, closing the notebook with a satisfied smile. "Just like our friendship soup," announced 7-year-old Destiny, pointing at the steaming pot. "We made it with love, right, Chef Lucas?" "That's right," Lucas said, ladling the soup into bowls while the children lined up eagerly. "Love and vegetables, and a little bit of magic." As the children dispersed to their families with bowls of soup and hearts full of story, Lucas and Marisol found themselves alone in the corner of the kitchen, the noise of the dining room a distant hum around them. "Thank you," Lucas said, the words carrying more weight than their simplicity suggested. "For coming tonight, for sharing Esperanza's story, for giving those kids something beautiful." Marisol set the notebook on the prep counter between them, her fingers still resting on its leather cover. "Clara told me about the donations, the food, the supplies for the library program. She said someone wanted to help but didn't want credit." Lucas felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I wasn't trying to buy forgiveness." "I know," Marisol said softly. "That's what made me realize I might have been wrong. About your motives, about what our friendship meant to you." The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. Lucas wanted to rush forward, to bridge the gap with words and explanations, but something in Marisol's expression warned him to wait. "I was angry," she continued, "but not just about the lying. I was angry because I thought it meant I didn't matter to you as a person, that I was just a charity case, a way for you to feel better about your success." "You were never a charity case," Lucas said with quiet intensity. "You saved me, Marisol. That first night, when you gave me your sandwich, it wasn't just food. It was a reminder that kindness exists, that connection is possible, that there's still magic in the world if you know how to look for it." Tears gathered in Marisol's eyes, though she blinked them back quickly. "I've been thinking about the story I wrote, about the chef and the sparrow. I think I got the ending wrong." "How so?" "I made it sound like the chef was helping the sparrow out of pity, like he was the one with all the power. But that's not how it really happened, is it?" She gestured around the kitchen, at the evidence of shared purpose and mutual aid. "We helped each other. We're still helping each other." Lucas nodded, feeling something tight in his chest begin to loosen. "So what's the real ending?" A small smile crossed Marisol's face, transforming her features with its warmth. The chef and the sparrow realized that the kitchen is big enough for both of them. They cook together, tell stories together, and remind each other why food matters. And when other hungry creatures show up at their door, they invite them in too. "I like that ending better," Lucas said. "Me too." Marisol picked up the notebook, but instead of clutching it protectively, she held it casually, like a tool rather than a shield. "Clara mentioned something about starting a regular storytelling program here, combining cooking lessons with stories about food and friendship. Would you be interested in helping with something like that?" "Only if we do it together," Marisol said, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since she had learned his true identity. "Partners, not patron and charity case. Equals who bring different skills to the same table." Lucas felt his heart lift, not with the giddy rush of new infatuation, but with the steady warmth of something deeper and more sustainable. "Partners," he agreed. In the kitchen and out of it. As they began cleaning up the evening's dishes, working side by side in the familiar rhythm of shared labor, Lucas reflected on how much had changed since that first night in the alley. He had sought escape from his emptiness and found purpose instead. Marisol had offered a sandwich and received a community in return. Together, they had discovered that nourishment came in many forms: food, stories, friendship, and the quiet satisfaction of feeding others. "Same time next week?" Marisol asked as they prepared to leave. "Same time next week," Lucas confirmed, but he was already planning beyond that. There would be more stories to tell, more meals to share, more children to inspire with the magic of cooking and storytelling combined. Outside, the November air carried the promise of winter, but inside the warmth they had created together, spring felt eternal. They walked up the stairs side by side, neither rescuer nor rescued, but simply two people who had found their way home to each other and to the work that mattered most, feeding the world, one story and one meal at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.